Well, good evening again, everyone. Thank you for being with us tonight. And this is Clare Lopez, Lopez Liberty LLC, here with you for another episode of Sharia Crime Stoppers. And tonight, with special thanks for Mary, who gave me some very good ideas for topics not coronavirus that would be good to cover tonight, just to give an idea, a little bit of an overview, a tour d'horizon, if you will, of some other things that are still going on in the world. So let me begin with some border issues. And I'm talking here especially about our US southern border with Mexico. And we saw online a very good interview that I recommend to you. It was streamed at bigleaguepolitics.com just a day or two ago. No, it was actually the 30th of April. So that's about 3, 4, 5 days ago or so. And the interview was with the former ICE chief, Tom Homan, ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement of DHS. He was ICE chief, Tom Homan was ICE chief between 2017 and 2018, at which point he retired. A lot of us are kind of hoping maybe he could be recruited back into public service. DHS certainly needs his experience more than ever now, but we'll have to see about that. But in any case, on the interview, Tom Homan was talking about how if for some unforeseen awful reason that Joe Biden were to win the presidential election come this November 2020, Tom Homan said that the US will lose the border. He means the southern US border with Mexico on day one. We'll lose the border on day one, he said. Of a Biden presidency. And everything that President Trump has achieved in his now coming on 4 years in office, well over 3.5 years, which include an 80% reduction in illegal alien crossing of that border, all that's gone, said Tom Homan, if Biden comes in. The interview, I should add at this point, I told you bigleaguepolitics.com, but the interview that he did was for the Center for Immigration Studies. You can look that one up at its website, an excellent organization there. Now, the mass migration, the mass surge to the border that we might expect if a Joe Biden presidency, election win were to happen, that border surge would just almost be automatic and immediate. And naturally, many of those coming for our border would be expecting leniency because, of course, Joe Biden has pretty much said that he disagrees with, everything President Trump has done or said about protecting the sovereign integrity of our borders. And they know that. I will mention that Tom Homan has a new book coming out, not out yet, but should be out shortly. And it's called Defend the Border and Save Lives. Don't know the exact date for that, but stay tuned. It will be coming out soon. Last note on this topic, I want to mention that back in January this year, the 18th of January, well, it went 17, 18, 19 of January this year, was a great big wonderful conference in Greenville, South Carolina, and it was called Rock the Red USA. And for those of us lucky to be there, as I was, and who got to see Tom Homan speak, he brought down the house. His speech, his talk was about his own experiences within Customs and Border Protection, well before he became ICE chief, but during his own earlier years, the years when he gained so much experience on that border, and his talk just moved people. He was mobbed after the talk, as you might well imagine. In any case, Tom Homan keep a watch for what happens with him next. Next topic for tonight that I want to talk about is Dr. Stephen Kirby. He is the author of a book called Islamic Doctrine versus the U.S. Constitution. And this is one of the very last books that I got to edit and bring out to publication while I was still at CSP, Center for Security Policy, maybe one of the reasons I'm not there anymore. The book was published on the 4th of December, 2019. You can find it on Amazon.com, Islamic Doctrine versus the U.S. Constitution. And the story of this book is that I had been reading Dr. Stephen Kirby's columns and his articles, most of those at Pipeline News, but also sometimes published at Jihad Watch, the David Horowitz outlet run by director of Jihad Watch, Robert Spencer. And I've been reading these during the earlier part of 2019. And Dr. Kirby was in these columns one by one, laying out a comparison contrast between amendments to the U.S. Constitution from the Bill of Rights, compare contrast of that with Islamic law, with Sharia. And after I'd read a couple or so of those, I thought this would make a really good book. So I got in touch with Dr. Kirby and I said, could you expand your coverage of the constitutional amendments to a few more, add a prefix, not a prefix, an introduction chapter and maybe a conclusion chapter, and I'll write a foreword to the book and we'll make it a monograph. And so we did. And he did a fantastic job with this book. And as I said, it was finished, came out in the early part of December 2019. Now, the purpose of the book and his columns and each chapter now in the book, the purpose was to show how Sharia, how Islamic law is in direct contradiction to the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and of course our Declaration of Independence and so many of the Judeo-Christian principles upon which our constitutional republic is founded. Now, in the book, finally we came up with 6 amendments to cover, and these are the 1st, 2nd, 4th, let's see, 6th, no, 1st, 2nd, 4th, 8th, 13th, and 14th. Those are the ones that were covered in the book. And some of the topics that those chapters and those amendments versus Sharia cover, I'll just go through a few of them here briefly. But I encourage you to get the book because it's very well written. He's a very good scholar, but also writes in a very clear and an easy way to follow and to read for someone who may not be the expert that he is. Well, some of these contradictions involve things like this. Under our Judeo-Christian based constitution and system of law, we value and cherish the primacy of the individual in society and the equality of all in human dignity before the rule of man-made law. No such thing in Sharia. We hold that the freedom of religion, the freedom of belief, which is enshrined in the First Amendment, is precious. Freedom of speech in the First Amendment, the right to bear arms, Second Amendment, the right to freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, the Fourth Amendment, no cruel and unusual punishment, the Eighth Amendment, the absolute repugnance of slavery, never mind sex slavery. This would be found or at least contradicted by our 13th Amendment. And then, of course, the entire sanctity of life, liberty, property in the 13th and the 14th Amendments versus the Islamic systems of dhimitude and the payment of jizya by second-class citizens, being Christians and Jews, who were conquered by Islam and forced to live, if they wanted to live, under that subjugation. And then finally, what Steve does with this book, and in particular with the very last chapter of the book, is to highlight the dilemma for Muslims in public office or seeking public office, because there's no way on earth they can take the oath of office pledging loyalty to the US Constitution and all of these things we've just mentioned here, and these amendments and many more, pledge loyalty to the US Constitution as stipulated in Article 6 of the Constitution. By the way, I don't know how many umpteen copies, these wonderful little copies, pocket-sized copies of the Constitution and Declaration that the Heritage Foundation puts out. But that's my ready reference for the Constitution and the Declaration. But in any case, the point here being that there's no way to pledge, sincerely to pledge, allegiance to the Constitution of the United States as per the 6th Article 6 of the Constitution, which states that the Constitution and the laws derived from it shall be the supreme law of the land. No way to pledge total and complete allegiance to that if at the same time one continues to harbor allegiance to an alien and a hostile and a competing legal system called Sharia or Islamic law. And so if a candidate, or maybe someone already elected to office, is a truly faithful and a practicing Muslim, there's a real conundrum here. There's a real contrast. There's a real conflict here. And as Steve goes into quite a bit of detail in the book, and I really recommend that to you, there are ways that a faithful Muslim can get around that faithful, sincere pledge to the Constitution. For example, muttering under their breath, inshallah, right? If God wills it. Well, obviously, Allah does not will a faithful practicing Muslim to abrogate allegiance to Sharia. And so there goes the oath, right? So many of these sorts of things he goes into some detail in the book. Now, I wanted to mention to you here that Steve Kirby, again, has a new project. It's called the Muslim Oath Project. And you can find his very comprehensive article about this project at Pipeline News. I mentioned that before. Pipeline News from the 1st of May, May the 1st, he published an article there that explains this new project, the Muslim Oath Project. Well, what's this about? So Dr. Kirby, is talking about what about Muslim candidates for office in this election year of 2020? Or what about those already elected to office and maybe they're running for re-election? And so here's what Dr. Kirby did a little bit earlier this year, and he explains this in the article. Back on the 10th of February, 2020, this year, Dr. Kirby sent an email to 36 individual Muslims who either are running right now or had been running at some time previously for public office at all kinds of different levels of government across the US. And that would be anything from, a local city council or library board or school board, all the way on up to higher office at the state, maybe the county, or even the federal level. And so he mentioned in this email to them the fact that each, upon election, would be required to raise right hand and swear or affirm an oath to the US Constitution. And so he asks these questions. He said in his email, he asked them, he said, on the record now, do you stand for the First Amendment, freedom of speech, the protection to the right to criticize and to disagree with Muhammad? He asked, The First Amendment also guarantees the right of religious freedom, the right to join or to leave any religion at any time, or to have no religious affiliation at all. And so he asks in the email, do you, on the record again, do you support and defend the idea that in the United States, Muslims have the right to leave Islam and should have no fear of physical harm or retaliation? Another question in the email: the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution forbids cruel and unusual punishment. Do you, question, agree with Allah and Muhammad about the hudud punishments? You know, these are the ones derived from the Quran, which is believed by all faithful devout Muslims to be the literal word of God, of Allah. And the hudud punishments include things like amputation, beheading, crucifixion, flogging, and on and on. So the question he puts in the email, do you, recipient of this email, agree with Allah and Muhammad on the hudud punishments, or should we here in America follow US law, Eighth Amendment, that forbids such cruel and unusual punishments as these? And then one more question on polygamy. In the United States, polygamy, that is having more than one wife, is illegal. One man, one woman, or at least one and one, is the legal law of the land, not multiple partners. But do you, Muslim recipient of this email, do you agree with Allah that it is legal for a man to have up to 4 wives, or do you follow, and will you follow, US law that forbids such things? Now, out of the 36 emails he sent, only three people clearly came back, wrote back to him, and clearly stated their support for the US Constitution over Islamic doctrine. Now, whether they were telling the truth or not, we have no idea, but 3 did this. A number of others sent various kinds of responses, or kind of no answers, like, I'll get back to you. I'm really tied up right now, but I can answer you next week. And then, of course, they never did. And the majority of the 36 to whom he sent these questions simply did not respond at all. So there we have that. And again, I'll recommend to you Steve Kirby's book, Islamic Doctrine versus the US Constitution, and his new Muslim Oath Project. All right, let's move along to one more topic here. And that is something Mary suggested that I give an update on the Michael Flynn case, because there's been so much news coming out about that recently. Now, you'll know, of course, that General Michael Flynn served his country in uniform in the US Army for 36 years as a true patriot. And he was the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency before being tapped by President Trump, or incoming President Trump, back in January of 2017, tapped to be his national security advisor. Now, unfortunately, as we all know, Michael Flynn was entrapped. He was set up. He was dragged through court. His life was just wrecked. His family was put through hell. He wound up pleading guilty to a crime he did not commit, that is lying to the FBI, which he did not do. So that is to set the scene here of what has transpired so far. So let me mention that just recently, earlier, I think this year, might have been late last year, but in any case, in recent months, General Flynn ditched his old legal team and brought on the extremely impressive defense lawyer, Sidney Powell. She has been doing just a spectacular job. And I hope that some of you may have seen her in various news interviews on TV, maybe online, or read some of the columns and articles that she has written. But she is just really going to town on this case, and in defense of General Flynn. He's finally got the defense that he needs. Now, I will also give a tip of the hat at this point to Tom Fitton and the team at Judicial Watch, because they've been extremely helpful also in prying documents out of the US government using the tool of the Freedom of Information Act and going to court when they need to do that as well. Now, the latest update here is from last month, meaning April of 2020. And what happened is that in late April, the very end, 20th or so, I might not have that date exactly right, but the end of April 2020, a number of really important documents were unsealed, that is by a judge, by the court, confirming that a small group of Trump-hating senior FBI officials set what is called a perjury trap for Mike Flynn in order specifically not to follow up to investigate a crime, which is what they're supposed to be doing, but rather to trump up, that's a bad word, isn't it, to entrap him into a non-existent crime that would allow them to remove him, to get him removed as Trump's incoming national security advisor before General Flynn, as they feared he would do, and he probably would have, before he could uncover their coup plotting against President Trump. The whole thing was a setup, in other words. Now, what happened in the end is that Michael Flynn was eventually charged with, I guess, a single count of making a false statement to federal officials. And that regards his late December 2019 telephone conversation with the Russian ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Kislyak. Now, of course, for a senior embassy official, the ambassador in this case, of a hostile adversary government like Moscow's, those phone calls are always going to be monitored. And so indeed, this one certainly was. And so, of course, the FBI already had the transcript of that whole phone call. And unfortunately, General Flynn did not just ask them, demanded that the entire text of that transcript be put on the table before they said another word. That would have stopped the thing cold, but it didn't happen. So they interrogated him about this phone call without the text of the transcript there before them. And actually, upon completion of the interview, which was done under spurious pretenses, as dirty cop James Comey, former now fired director of the FBI, said in a news interview sometime back, you know, that in another administration, a more organized administration, you know, he would have had to go through White House lawyers and the Justice Department, and then Michael Flynn would have had a lawyer present with him. But, you know, because they were just getting started with this administration, as James Comey said in the interview, I just sent a couple guys over. And they entrapped him like that. But even so, after that interview, it's apparent now from documents that have come out that the interviewing FBI agents did not believe that General Flynn lied about anything. And they wrote this, but what they wrote was either hidden, covered up, or altered in order to make it look like General Flynn had lied. That was a complete miscarriage of justice. That's criminal, is what that is. By December 2017, that's now fast forward to the end of that year, Mike Flynn was coerced into pleading guilty to avoid prosecution threats to go after his son. That's what they were doing. Completely, not just unprofessional, but unethical and illegal. He was financially drained. He had to sell his house at that point to pay legal bills, but he always maintained his innocence. And he later moved to have that guilty plea to the court withdrawn. Now, early 2019 is now when Sidney Powell comes into the picture, into his defense, and begins a review of just mountainous piles of documents related to this case, to the Flynn case. And also, of course, with the help of Tom Fitton and Judicial Watch. And they uncovered, in so doing, so much incriminating evidence against these dirty FBI, DOJ prosecutors, the Mueller team, all of that. There was found corroborating evidence that General Flynn's plea indeed was coerced, that documents, key documents, were withheld from the defense team, including exculpatory evidence was withheld against the law. That is illegal to do that. All evidence, especially exculpatory evidence, must be presented by the prosecution to the defense. They did not do that, but now the documents are out. And so at this point, a growing consensus is forming that General Flynn's guilty plea should be vacated. He should be allowed to withdraw it. The plea should be vacated, and the case simply dismissed for prosecutorial misconduct. The case is in the hands of Judge Emmett Sullivan. But also important to note is that Attorney General William Barr has weighed in and assigned an independent U.S. attorney to review the entire Flynn case. You probably also will have heard President Trump when asked, I think it was in a news interview by a reporter about the Flynn case, and he answered something to the effect that he was looking into a pardon for General Flynn. But a lot of us think that it should never even get to the point of a pardon, because the whole guilty plea ought to be withdrawn. It should be accepted that it's withdrawn, and then the case simply dismissed again for prosecutorial misconduct. And in that case, then there would be no need for a pardon, because Michael Flynn would never be found guilty, properly so. All right, that is the end of that case. Of course, at the end of this, I'll welcome all of your questions. So keep these subjects in mind as we go along. I just have one or two more things. The next one I want to talk about is about Iran, and Caroline Glick, who's a superb writer and an analyst and an observer of all things Israeli, of course, but also more broadly the Middle East, and certainly as regards the Iranian threat to Israel and the world. Well, you may know she writes a regular column. You can get on her distribution email list if you would like to do that. In any case, the 1st of May, so that's just a few days ago, Caroline Glick published a column called "The Final Days of the Iran Nuclear Deal." And so just to back up a bit and set the scene for you, as she does in her piece, in May of 2018, we'll recall that President Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA. That's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or sometimes just called the Iran Nuclear Deal, that the P5+1, that means the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, Russia, China, Germany, France, UK, and the United States. I'm sorry, Germany is the +1 part of that, part of it all, right? US. The P5+1 all agreed to this JCPOA, this nuclear deal, back in July of 2015. Well, when President Trump was running for office, and certainly after he took office, he often condemned, criticized this nuclear deal as the worst deal ever agreed to in the history of the world, I guess. And he's right. And so he did withdraw the United States from it in May of 2018. And part of that then was the reimposition of very harsh sanctions by the United States against Iranian oil, financial matters, shipping, the ability to ship, especially ship oil. I should back up for just a quick moment here and mention that, by the way, I think you probably all know that JCPOA, or that nuclear deal, was never, ever signed by a single party to it, the P5+1. There's no signature on it by any of the 5+1, Germany, or Iran itself. Nobody signed it. That's why it's called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It's not called an agreement. It's certainly not called a treaty. But in any case, so the sanctions came down very hard on Iran under President Trump. It was called, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has called this the campaign of maximum pressure. Now, Mike Pompeo often talks about imposing this maximum pressure campaign on the Iranian regime in order to change its behavior or to bring it back to the table. Now, I don't know if he actually believes that or not, but as top diplomat for the United States, this is the right thing for him to say, I guess. I certainly would never say it. I guess that's maybe why I'm not Secretary of State. I don't think the behavior of this regime can be changed. It is a jihadist, revolutionary regime. It has been since the Ayatollah Khomeini staged the revolution back in 1979. It's written in the Iranian constitution that it is a jihad regime, a revolutionary regime whose intent is to spread Islam and Sharia across the entire world and to establish an Islamic state globally. That's in their constitution. So no, they're not going to change their behavior. But nevertheless, the maximum pressure campaign has continued with full support from the Trump team, including Secretary of State Pompeo, whom you might recall, I think it was in the mid-part summer or so of 2018, Pompeo gave a remarkable speech out at the Reagan Library in California, in which he laid out, remember this, the 12 demands. The 12 demands on Iran. I don't have them all in front of me, and I don't think you probably want me to go through them all anyway at this point, but they include things like halting all work on a nuclear enrichment, a nuclear program, all work on WMD period, weapons of mass destruction, all work halted on intercontinental ballistic missiles, an end to support for terror, Islamic terror groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and etc. An end to the horrific human rights abuses against its own people, and so on. These were among the 12 demands. Well, I think he knew perfectly well, and so do we, that this Iranian regime will never agree to any of those. But these are the demands. And unless met, the maximum pressure campaign continues. And primarily that is a matter of financial pressure, which really has devastated the Iranian economy, unfortunately falling very heavily on the poor people, many of whom are living in real poverty. I mean, poverty we don't even understand in this country. But all along, the other partners to the JCPOA, certainly China and Russia, which were never expected to go along with these demands, but also Britain, France, and Germany, and they also did not agree to placing this kind of financial pressure on Iran, and kept hoping against hope, I guess, practically to the current day, that they could somehow preserve the deal. I guess maybe thinking, until Trump is out of office or something, and get Iran back to the table and maybe come to agreement on some better deal or something. But in any case, the P5+1 are not supporting us, not supporting the United States campaign of maximum pressure against the Iranian regime. And China, just to make one point of the different behavior by the other partners to the nuke deal, China continues to this day to import Iranian gas and oil and is working very closely with Iran in Afghanistan together with the Taliban. That's China. And again, as I said, it's probably likely that many of these just hope that they can, wait out the year until our November elections, and then maybe Trump won't be reelected in November, and then Joe Biden would fall into all of their hands like a little piece of rotten fruit. I guess that's what they're hoping for. The problem, however, is that Iran is not really helping its case very much, if that's what they want these other partners to do, to support them and help them and keep them going. Iran is not being particularly helpful about this. So what Iran's been doing, and verifiably so, and to its credit, reported by the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the nuclear program monitoring agency of the United Nations. And they've been documenting these things. So what's Iran been doing? Well, increasing its stockpile of enriched uranium, increasing the amount or the number of its advanced centrifuges, which can spin up more enriched uranium in a shorter period of time and to higher levels of enrichment, all banned or illegal under the nuclear deal. Iran's regime has refused the IAEA's request to send inspectors to visit 3 undeclared nuclear sites that have now come to all of our attention, partly through satellite photography, which you can see online. And then the Iranian Atomic Energy Agency director, Ali Akbar Salehi, really doesn't help the Iran case at all, because he very recently he announced that Iran is building 2 more nuclear reactors at Bushehr, this city at the sort of the southern border of Iran along the Persian Gulf there, where their first heavy water plutonium reactor was built a long time ago, started by the Russians, finished by the Germans. But there, Salehi says they're building 2 more. And as you probably know, a heavy water reactor can produce enriched plutonium, and plutonium is a parallel way to make a nuclear bomb, along with the other way, which is with enriched uranium. And you get that enriched uranium out of those centrifuges in places like Natanz, for example. And here's Ali Akbar Salehi again, and here's a quote, a direct quote from him just a short time ago. He said, quote, "Nuclear activities, as well as research and development on the nuclear fuel cycle, uranium conversion and enrichment, including production and storage, are being carried out without any restriction," close quote. Well, that doesn't sound like Iran is adhering to the JCPOA either. They're not, by the way. And this is without even discussing the clandestine Iranian nuclear weapons program. Yes, they have always had, since the late 1980s, a clandestine nuclear weapons program that has never stopped. It may have hiccuped a time or two, but it has never stopped. They have taken a very long time. I don't know of another nuclear power on the face of the earth. It's taken, I don't know, 32 years or so to achieve a deliverable nuclear weapon, but that's the Iranians. With the help, by the way, of every rogue nuclear power on the face of the earth, from China to North Korea, Russia, and Pakistan. But in any case, they are in violation now, and certifiably so, of the nuclear deal. Meanwhile, they've got real chutzpah, as the Israelis might say. And I'm pulling up here for you an article that I wrote about this. It's called The Iranian Regime Wants an IMF Loan, International Monetary Fund loan. How about regime change instead? I published this article at the Drudge Report on April the 25th. And I go into some detail in there about Iran's chutzpah, its many violations of the nuclear deal, its support for terrorism. It's launching, by the way, a military satellite into orbit, the first one it's ever achieved, been able to do, a military satellite into orbit, which circles the Earth on a daily basis on what's called a polar trajectory. A polar trajectory means that instead of going around the Earth sort of horizontally, it's doing it vertically. And it goes over the two poles. It's called a polar trajectory, right? And it's coming up at the United States when it crosses the Western Hemisphere every single day, as it does now, from the south. Now, in Cold War years, and when Russia was contemplating the same sort of thing, it was called a fractional orbital bombardment system. And what it means is that Iran, and certainly Russia did, and Soviets did, and others must know too, that the United States has absolutely no radar and no missile defense along our southern borders or eastern borders. That means along the Gulf of Mexico or up along the eastern coast, the Atlantic coast. We have no radar and no ballistic missile defense. So where do their missiles or where do their satellites come up at us from? Out of the south. By the way, the North Koreans have two I keep calling them missiles. It could be missiles. They have two satellites up in the very same sort of orbit, polar trajectory orbit, coming up at the United States every day also. Two of them, one launched in 2012, one in 2014, on that same polar trajectory coming over the United States from the south. So now there's three, two from North Korea, one from Iran, and we don't know what's in them. They called them satellites, but they're of a size and an attitude of orbit that could contain, possibly might, I'm not saying they do, could, might possibly contain a nuclear charge. How about an EMP, electromagnetic pulse charge? Peter Pry, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry talks about this, and how if it were, any of those were possibly to contain such a weapon, an EMP, it could be remote detonated from the Earth at any time they chose. How's that? So these are the kinds of things that Iran is engaged in now, at the same time that it is begging the IMF for a loan. I think the amount is $5 billion, if I recall. Yes, $5 billion. And by the way, too, this is at a time when the supreme leader of Iran, that is the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, when his personal net worth in funds that he controls, bank accounts that he controls, amounts to over 20 billion, I'm sorry, not 20, $200 billion. That is an estimate by the United States State Department. $200 billion under the sole control of the supreme leader of Iran. And they're begging the IMF for a $5 billion handout because coronavirus, you know. Well, how about tapping into your supreme leader's funds? He's got plenty. That's what we call chutzpah. All right. Next steps, looking forward as regards Iran, and I'm hearkening back here to the Caroline Glick column. And so coming up in this October, the 23rd of October this year, 2020, is the next deadline for the United States. Well, I shouldn't say just the United States, for the arms embargo, conventional arms embargo placed on Iran with the JCPOA comes up for reconsideration once again, and that would be under the auspices of UN Resolution 2231. Already, US Secretary of State Pompeo has announced that United States will not allow that embargo to be lifted, even as Russia already right now is gearing all up to sell a whole bunch of different kinds of military equipment to the Tehran regime in anticipation of the embargo being lifted. But mark your calendars for October on that score. Now, to conclude on this topic, I think, and many others think, certainly I believe Caroline Glick thinks too, we need to just cancel the JCPOA entirely, and that would then trigger what's called snapback sanctions, again under UN Resolution 2231, that was passed immediately after the July 2015 nuke deal itself. The deal is sort of anchored, if you will, in the UN resolution. That is its United Nations anchor, if you will think of it or want to call it that. Now others, like the rest of the P5+1, want to block the US action that would trigger those snapback sanctions by canceling the JCPOA outright. But we'll note that the European Union is in a very much weakened position right now, certainly over what is perceived by many people in Europe to be its incompetence in dealing with the coronavirus. And what I mean is not individual countries dealing with it, but rather the actions of Brussels, and how countries, that a short time previously were all about open borders and, let the migrants flow in, and, we don't need borders. Schengen Accord had, I think, 28, if I recall correctly, members in it, open borders. Well, coronavirus hit, and what happened? Boy, those borders snapped closed pretty darn fast. And not only that, but then when some very hard hit members of the EU, like Italy, were asking, and later Spain too, were asking for help, desperately needed help to fight the coronavirus because they really got hit hard. Did the rest of the EU come to their assistance, rush to help them? No, they did not at all. They said, you're on your own. That's what they said. So in view of all of that, allegiance to the idea of a European Union is sort of losing a bit of its luster. And certainly the poor leadership coming out of Brussels, the headquarters, right, of the EU, the leadership of Brussels is really not held in very high esteem at this point in time. So what I mean, all of that said, with the loss of faith in leadership, Brussels is losing its grip on the European Union, and therefore perhaps also on keeping together any kind of unity, again, meaning the British, the French, the Germans, on this deal. Now, I think it's becoming obvious to all, to sum up this last section here, it's becoming obvious to everyone that Iran acted in bad faith. What's always acted in bad faith? It's in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that goes back to the 1970s, to which, by the way, it is still a signatory, but certainly acted in bad faith as regards the JCPOA. They've always had a nuclear weapons program, clandestine. It was clandestine, by the way, from about 1988 under Khomeini, before he died, until the year 2002, August of 2002, when the Iranian opposition, the Democratic Mujahideen-e Khalq National Council of Resistance of Iran, first blew the lid off that clandestine program. Those 14 years, the world and even the IAEA didn't know that Iran had a nuclear weapons program. They may have suspected, perhaps intelligence services knew or suspected, but it wasn't publicly known. Well, 2002, the lid gets blown off, the satellite photos are published, Natanz is revealed, Isfahan's revealed, Kaylee electric plant is revealed, Lavizan, et cetera, all revealed. And so what I'm getting at here is that they've always had a clandestine program, and even after it got revealed and they pretended to cooperate with the IAEA and become open about it, all that meant is that the real program simply went underground. And I do mean that literally, under mountains, in bunkers and tunnels underground. But people are waking up to this now. And they're seeing that Iran was never sincere about any of these treaties or any of these negotiations. And certainly after the revelations brought forth by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after the raid on that warehouse in downtown Tehran in early, let's see, I think the raid was in early 2016. They waited until President Trump was in office in 2017 to announce it. And in any case, those documents, I mean, just thousands and thousands of documents and hard drives and computer files and what have you, seized in that raid, really explained in a lot of detail, theretofore unknown, about the Iranian nuclear weapons program, went under the name the Ahmad Project. Anyway, all of this now taken together, there is consensus, I mean, willing or not, consensus developing that Iran is definitely pursuing a deliverable nuclear weapon, that it's been lying from the beginning about its nuclear weapons program. And with all this corroboration, there's got to be a reassessment of the JCPOA. Stay tuned for that next important date, as I said, in October coming up, and that would be a date to watch, the deadline for removing the conventional arms embargo against Iran. But even sooner than that, to see a complete collapse of the nuclear accord of the JCPOA. That's what Caroline Glick writes. That's what I agree with completely. Stay tuned. All right, very last bit before we turn to Q&A for you. And this comes from a few days ago at Jihad Watch from our good friend, Robert Spencer, on the 29th of April. And just wanted to highlight this for you. We're in the merry month of Ramadan, of course. And so this column at Judicial Watch, written by Hesham Shahab, talks about an imam, an Islamic preacher in, where is he? I think in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, who gave a speech, well, or a sermon, that found its way to YouTube. This is great when they come out on YouTube. And his name is the Imam Omar Baloch. And he's talking about the coronavirus pandemic. And of course, I don't know how they come to this, but it's the same conclusion every time, no matter what happens. Blames the Jews for the coronavirus pandemic. And he warns Muslims openly and explicitly to arm themselves against their neighbors. I've not seen until this an open call for Muslims to get weapons and arm themselves. But this guy did it, and he did it on YouTube. So he calls the coronavirus in his sermon a Zionist American plot to throttle the growth of the Chinese economy. Or alternatively, it's a punishment from Allah. Or alternatively, he couldn't quite figure out which one it was, I guess. It's the work of shadowy secret societies. Well, in any case, he talks about the coronavirus pandemic being a very good opportunity, quote unquote, for Muslims to purchase firearms ahead of confrontation with their Trump supporting neighbors. How's that for Ramadan? All right, let me conclude there. I think we've gone a little bit long. Thank you for staying with us, but happy to take any questions that you may have.
Okay, Claire, thank you so much. I think we just look at the numbers of people that show up very promptly at 7 o'clock every time you're with us, and they stay and they stay, and the numbers are the biggest numbers we get. So I want you to know that, and
Thank you. It's nice
that's
to know.
that's an indication of our appreciation for sure. Well, let's go back here. A lot of topics. So let's see. We've got a topic here about Flynn. I guess people are a little confused. What is his current status? What would it take for him to be released? Is he actually in confinement while he's waiting for the next step?
No, General Flynn is not in confinement. He has entered a guilty plea in court of law to that single charge of lying to the FBI, for which he is in a very delayed, I think it's over a year now, a delay in sentencing. He has not been sentenced. He's just hanging in limbo. And it is during this period of time, I believe, again, it's lasted over a year. During this period of time is when new lawyer Sidney Powell, rock star lawyer, came into the picture, took his case, unearthed all of these documents, thanks Tom Fitton, Judicial Watch, etc. And now what they have done is gone back to the judge in the case, who is the one who would pronounce sentence but has not done so yet, went back to the judge, Sullivan, and sought to withdraw General Flynn's guilty plea. And now defense lawyer Sidney Powell is calling for the to vacate the entire plea, the entire case, to have it dismissed because of prosecutorial misconduct. And so while General Flynn remains in a kind of limbo, he's free, he's not in jail, he's not under any kind of detention. The case goes on, and these documents are coming out. That's the blockbuster of these last days and weeks. And so the whole case has changed now. Whereas before they were waiting for him to be pronounced sentence, which we didn't know what that would be. Now it's about he's exonerated. He is flat out exonerated. And it's a matter of what course the judge, the court takes to dismiss, to get rid of this case, because it's going to be gotten rid of, and he's going to be a free man. He's going to be exonerated. And you might have even heard President Trump on the last night's town hall that he did with Brett Baer and Martha McCallum at the Lincoln Memorial. What a setting. And there was a question, I don't know, from a citizen or one of the reporters there, I forget which, but that asked President Trump about General Flynn, and something to the effect of, would you bring him back into your administration? I mean, this is really looking ahead, right? But this shows where we're at with this. And the president responded that he thought General Flynn was a very good man, which indeed he is, and that he would consider bringing him into his administration in another future position. So this whole case is just, completely turned around, and, most of the thanks goes to Sidney Powell.
Thank you. That's what we needed to hear, and that's very, very helpful. Another question Kathy asked you: how much confidence do you have that Biden won't be elected president? It's her comment. I'm beginning to get quite concerned about it with all the lies spouting with the media. It's sure I'm sure it's having a negative effect on Trump. So this is just your opinion on potential here.
Yeah, no, I can see how it could be discouraging to listen to all of that. Certainly we're all sitting home a lot more than usual and probably watching way too much TV. But Joe Biden, I don't even know if he's going to make it to summertime. Mm-hmm. Honestly, it's hard to watch some of his, basement of his home statements, and
Right.
trying to speak, trying to put together coherent sentences one after the other, trying not to lose his train of thought, trying to respond coherently to an interview, even by a friendly a reporter, as this past weekend, Micah, what's her name?
Oh,
From
yeah.
MSNBC, I believe it
Right.
is.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Zabriskie.
yeah, she's a Joe Biden supporter, but she did ask tough questions. A lot of us, we give her credit for a very solid, good interview. Put him on the spot as regards the Tara Reid allegations of rape, and he could not even put together an answer. He went dead silent for like 15 seconds
Yeah.
at one point, but that's just one example. I've heard it referred to even as elder abuse. The guy, he doesn't have it together anymore. He can't speak. He can't hold his thoughts. He can't sequence thoughts and sentences together. I don't know what they're going to do, the Democrats, but I really have my doubts about whether, even though he's the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party, I've got my doubts if he's even going to make it to a Democratic National Convention, or what will happen there. What is it now? It's postponed to, I think, August. Is that right? And it might, I don't know, take place virtually, or maybe they can gather together at that point in person. I don't know. But stay tuned, because number one, poor Joe Biden is just, I feel bad for the guy and his family, but he's just not going to make it. But number two, with all fingers, and I guess toes too, all crossed, that as the economy begins to open back up again, and the Trump administration rolls out and puts together through Treasury Secretary Mnuchin's plan, and the rest of the team there at the White House, Larry Kudlow, certainly, the plan to reopen America's businesses. And you probably heard Larry Kudlow, I think it was on the talk shows yesterday, Sunday talk shows, really very positive about where this economy is going to go beginning the third quarter of this year. Second quarter, lost cause, no question about that. But the recovery that he's predicting for the third quarter would really, I think, put President Trump in a very good position come November. But all is in the future. Wait to be seen, and I will keep all my fingers and toes crossed.
If it wasn't so serious, this would be a really interesting opportunity for a scriptwriter. Put together the Joe Biden story, as well as the maneuvering by the Democratic governors who want to get attention to be on the ticket somewhere, to be envisioned as part of the leadership with or without Joe, et cetera. So it is what it is. I think the notion of the economy, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Obviously, the Democrats are clearly focusing on making sure the economy does not come back.
Yeah, that's
very
obvious.
A key comment, and we'll see how that goes.
I mean, at the expense of how many millions of unemployed Americans, broken businesses. They don't care. They just don't care. It's incredible.
Yeah. People are asking about different references to the articles. Let's see here if I can pull one up here. Brenda's asking, what was the date of the Jihad Watch article where it talks about the imam telling Muslims to get armed?
That Jihad Watch article came out April 29. April 29.
Okay. Another comment is, did YouTube call that imam out for advocating violence against his neighbor? Oh.
Next question.
Wow. You will be pulled off of YouTube if you even comment in a way that impacts, that is not in sync with the position of a governor related to reopening. We know of individual people who have seen that happening again. We're just going to bounce around with the questions. Can the Obama administration, including Valerie Jarrett, be cited for aiding and abetting an enemy for their dealings with Iran? I think it's a rhetorical question, but it's not bad to
yeah. I mean, obviously they acted in bad faith, but they are immune from prosecution on that score. That was administration policy. Plenty of us think that it was with malign intent, and certainly just a very, very bad deal. intended to empower Iran as a nuclear capable power, as well as hegemon of the region there in the Middle East. But no, they're not going to be prosecuted for that. But stay tuned on other matters that Attorney General Barr and perhaps the U.S. Attorney Durham might be looking at right now. We hope.
Well, this whole emergence of indictments, we've been without them for such a long time in serious matters. So it is interesting to see that somebody like Tom, the gentleman who left the ICE organization, can you say his
Homan,
last name?
Homan, Tom Homan.
And your reference to his, was it an interview or an article? People are curious.
It's actually on YouTube, and it is an article. Also, I mean, it was printed. Let me see, where did I put it? It was printed as an article with the interview kind of embedded in it. And well, where did I put it?
It was on Big Politics.
I heard a voice. Very.
It was on Big League Politics.
Thank you. Big League Politics. Right. So
Okay.
the article was printed. It's online, and then the video of the interview is embedded in the article.
So we have these people that speak out, and they leave the organization and they're able to speak out. We've also had famous whistleblowers like our friend Filippini, who was from the same organization. He was from actually CPD, Border Patrol. Speaking of Filippini, we had an indictment this recently of Charles Edwards. Charles Edwards was the nemesis for Philip in the agency.
Right.
He was the IG in the agency who went after Filippini. And now he left the agency, Charles Edwards did. He's been indicted within the last week for criminal charges. So that's just an interesting footnote for.
And it had to do, as I recall, right, with the mishandling or was it destruction of official government records? Wasn't that it?
I believe that was it. I believe the latest one is he seemed to have left the office with some things that that was the property of the government that he then turned into some private software or whatever.
But it had to do with government records.
Yes, and at the time, he was even under some review when he was in the agency back then in terms of behavior. So this is Charles Edwards. And by the way, the other person, somebody just asked a question. Do we know anything about Ken Cuccinelli? Is he doing anything? Is he where he was before? His name was. We don't hear sometimes of these people, particularly the ones that are outspoken and that have been criticized by the media. Is he a factor? Do we know in DHS or? Well,
he's a very good guy. And as I understand it, I think he is still in an acting capacity as the deputy director of, or the deputy secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. I don't hear a whole lot about actions he's taking or particular cases,
seems to be under the radar a little bit.
We care about that he might be working on. Maybe it's under the radar. Just don't really know for sure.
Well, that's just related to the topic we talked about from time to time about how hard it is to crack into the administration, even the good administration under Donald Trump, and he's somewhere in there. So I guess that's why people are asking questions about him.
No, very, very good guy. We're glad he's in there. We're just hoping that he's having an impact in the direction that it needs to go.
Okay, the comments about Steve Kirby were really important as well. You mentioned his work. I believe he's also in his work, which is, I believe, at islamseries.org. I believe that's his site.
That's right.
He's come out with multiple questions and invited people to show up at meetings where these candidates or these public officials are, and to prepare themselves with a series of questions, to not sit together and to pepper the candidates with these questions. I think that's another asset of.
And as a matter of fact, the final chapter of this book is a collection of questions, suggested questions that citizens might prepare themselves with, take with them. Well, it would have been take with them in prior times, I guess, to a town hall, a meet and greet or some other kind of candidate meeting. Now, perhaps it would be on a webinar, but in any case, suggested questions that could be asked very politely, but with good thought put into them for the candidate.
I think there's even some suggestions about if they say this, this, and this. In other words, if they deflect, here's a way to deal with it. It's
Yeah.
pretty, right?
Yeah, he does. And there's a chapter here called Handling Evasive Responses.
That's it. Yeah.
Here are some responses that might be used to try to avoid having to answer your question. And he gives that, and then he says, so here's what you can do about it. By the way, there's also an appendix in this book at the end, questions for Canadians to ask of their elected officials or candidates running for office. So very useful, handy book, if I do say so myself.
Well, I think you should say so, because that you were part of that book. Let's face it, that's a great final deliverable within the center. You did, and I think it's so practical. We try so hard on this channel, on this station, to talk about action items. You know, this has got to be more than education. Most of us think we don't have unlimited time. In fact, we have 183 days related to the election and other things. So action, 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 and I think this book is loaded with really wonderful suggestions.
He did a wonderful job with it. Yeah,
okay,
Dr. Kirby.
Here's a question. Tell us more about the IMF. You know, we've heard about the World Health Organization, and we're learning things about that. Is the IMF one of these international? What should we know about the IMF in terms of its interest or not interest in giving a loan? But should we be concerned about the IMF?
Well, the IMF is one of those international bodies that was formed after World War II, along with things like the World Bank, for example. And it is it's a lending organization to which the members contribute certain amounts of money. And then what the IMF does is goes to countries which request it, which request a loan of it, and they assess that country's financial situation. Now, maybe it's due to some kind of natural disaster like a tsunami or, you know, a hurricane or some such thing as that. And then it's a pretty clear case of why they need emergency loan funding. But in other cases, for example, after the collapse of the USSR, and when all those nations of Eastern Europe broke free, and they were trying to set up, you know, for the first time in how many years, economies of their own, the IMF would go into those countries and help them to structure their financial matters in responsible ways, help them set up appropriate banking and you know, banking conditions, and to restructure, for example, a central command economy, such as, let's say, those Eastern European countries had under the Soviets, to be now, how do you switch from a socialist central command economy to a capitalist free market system? And so this is the kind of advice that the IMF would go into, and they would set up stages, if you will, and goals for these countries' governments to meet in order to qualify for loans. And but they would give very good advice, you know, to help with that kind of transition, for example, or just to take a basket case like, you know, Argentina, when its currency fell apart. How do you come back from that? How do you restructure? How do you, you know, restructure your debt load? Your how do you restructure your trade imbalance? Those kinds of things. So it's all of that. And I'm no economic expert, so I guess best thing might be to go to their website.
So here's another question: why would Britain and Germany and France and the other people, why would they favor Iran? What is it, an anti-Trump move that potentially keeps them on Iran's side? What is the economic or historical interest in Iran by those European countries?
Well, I think it's not so much favoring or liking the Iranian regime. You know, the leadership may or may not like President Trump very much. That's an observation that's true. But It has to do more, I think, with their own financial interests. They want that market. They want access to that market to sell things to Iran. They want deals. They want trade. And they don't want anybody upsetting that bilateral, as they would see it, each one bilateral relationship with the Iranian regime. And in return, they get oil, gas, and access to a very large market. The Iranian population is about, I think, around 82 or 83 million people right now. And they want access to that. And they value that and their individual companies' trade ties with Iran above any threat that they perceive or don't perceive from a developing Iranian nuclear weapons program.
What's that say about their support for Israel? Since Israel could be the...
Well, not so much. There's just not the kind of steadfast support for Israel that our own president and Congress, traditionally has given to Iran. Never a better personal relationship, I think, ever between American presidents, Trump now, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The friendship between those two men is remarkable. There's no such thing with the Europeans. They have long harbored animosity against Israel. I mean, I'm sorry, but remember back to World War II and how they treated their Jewish populations.
Well, and I think maybe it was one of your other presentations, the whole Al-Quds Iranian group, the brigade, that's focused on Jerusalem. And so
the Quds Force, right.
Quds Force,
in Arabic, Quds, Al-Quds means Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And so the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has a division called the Quds Force. And it's obvious what its intent is, to once again seize Jerusalem for Islam.
One last question, and I think this has got a couple people's attention, including my own. How is it we do not have any kind of protection from a south to north
Good question.
satellite EMP? I mean, how could that be?
Because I think, this is my best guess at it. Dr. Peter Vincent Pry is your world-class expert on this, and you can look him up, look up William Graham, look up a number of other experts in the field, but I'll give it my best. I think traditionally, certainly dating back to the Cold War years, after World War II, after both China and the Soviet Union acquired, the bomb, got the atomic bomb, our attention here in America and indeed North America, including Canada, was always focused to the north and the west. It was always thought that if an attack were to come from these adversaries, Russia and China, Soviet Union and China, it would come from the north over the North Pole, and that is why NORAD was set up. That is the joint North American Defense Pact between the United States and Canada, and then of course our own NORTHCOM, the Northern Command of the U.S. military, with its headquarters in the West, right? Where did we think this was coming from? The North and the West. So our own ballistic missile defenses, radar and missile bases are located out west because they're pointed at Asia or Eurasia, the Eurasian continent. And then of course, once North Korea got a nuclear capability, it was always thought that the attack would come from that direction. I don't know why nobody ever thought, at least until Soviet times, that, well, they could just launch it in another direction. And indeed, that term, fractional orbital bombardment system, comes from a recognition during the Cold War that the Soviets knew about that polar trajectory and our vulnerability, and would try or might try to come up at us that way. But given all that time, and we're talking decades, right? And we still haven't put up any permanent land-based missile defense.
Okay.
It's inexplicable, honestly, to me, and I'm sure to a lot of you. But if you want to do something, pepper your representatives with these questions. I will say this in favor of the president. He not only included the EMP threat in the most recent White House National Security Strategy that came out in, is it 2017 or 2018? 2017, I think, December, if I'm not mistaken, of 2017. There is a passage in there about the EMP threat. That's to his credit. And then more recently, there are two recent executive orders that have just come out, one within the last few days. And that executive order took a lot of us by surprise, actually, but it's a very good one. And it orders the United States not to outsource anymore for parts or components to our electric grid. And that means transformers and everything that goes into it, not to outsource, at least to adversaries. Now, we know that a lot of our transformers are built by allies like Germany and South Korea, but even so, we need to bring that production home. And that's what the executive order is about. And then there was an earlier one also from the Trump administration that addresses the EMP threat. So at least in that regard, EMP, there is some awareness of that threat, but goodness, we need to get some, I mean, at least what is one solution is called Aegis Ashore. Now the Aegis missile is a kind of ship launched missile to counter a ballistic missile, and it's called the Aegis missile system. It is on some of our ships. Some of those ships, but they have to be rather, I guess, close to the point of launch, because as I understand it, they have to get it in the launch or the boost phase of a missile launch. Maybe I've got that not quite right, but in any case, the Aegis system is on ships. The idea is take that missile and put it on shore, Aegis ashore, to transfer it to be a land-based system. Of course, there's THAAD, the thermal, what is it called? The thermal high altitude, whatever it is, that's a counter ballistic missile system as well that can get a missile out of the launch, out of the boost phase, and I believe even into its apogee, maybe even descent. But in any case, we don't have this along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic coast, and we need to.
Well, I think you've demonstrated that you and Mary are a team. You have not spoke about COVID hardly at all. And it's fascinating that we just realized the world's been moving, the world's going around. So thank you to Mary. Thank you, of course, for the delivery. By the way, Mary is pushing buttons, so people may not know that we are live on YouTube, have been the whole time. And that's another outreach we have in addition to our Zoom audience. So Claire, if you can just hang on with us for a couple more minutes, we're just going to do some administrative material and then invite you for a final comment.
Okay.
Let's do this correctly. Yeah, so we're really blessed to have Claire and our news analyst team with us. Let me just move this out of the way here. So just to keep you posted, we're pretty much solid for the rest of the month. And Claire will be back with us in June, and we just have to work out schedules with everybody's schedules for the month of June. But again, Claire, thank you so much for bringing your perspective. And, you know, it's different than Christine's and different than Leo's. And that's what we want. We want people, we want to use Tom Trento's note, make America think again. And again, this is called the enemies within. That's what we're talking about. It's not just COVID-19. We have plenty of enemies that are working hard against us. So Christine will be with us next Monday. Leo will be with us on the 18th. Christine will be with us on the Memorial Day as well. And if you've missed anything, of course, actually Claire's this tonight will be shortly available for people to just go back and watch on the YouTube on Sharia Crime Stoppers. So that's readily available later this evening. We want you to know we have one more additional webinar right now, and that's coming on the fourth Thursday. That's with Dr. Mark Christian. It's a great opportunity for us to get his news analysis because he's such a special person. He's an ex-Muslim. He was an imam, and he's a Christian convert, and he's out there in Nebraska. And so we would advise you to do that. I want to just make a comment here. We have so many partners that have blessed us at Sharia Crime Stoppers. And of course, we're trying to stop Sharia crime, but to do that, we've got to stop a bunch of other things. And Claire just laid out a whole bunch of other things that preclude, if in fact we do not stop some of the other activities of the red-green axis and the globalists, of course, Sharia crime will be intensifying. So Claire, we want people to follow you. We just put one thing down, which I hope is the right Twitter handle for you. Where else can people follow you during your
Right. Thank you, Dick. Well, so that is my Twitter handle, at Clare M. Lopez. I'm always happy to have new followers. I'm on Facebook with my name as well, Clare M. Lopez there. I publish in a number of different places. I have a blog at newsmax.com. I publish occasionally at the Drudge Report under Laura Loomer's, what would you call it, her block, her space. Most of, or all of, or really my written pieces, as well as videos and webinars like this, will eventually be cross-posted at the Citizens Commission on National Security. That's www.ccnationalsecurity.org. Let's see, where else? Often my things, videos and pieces are published up at the United West, the unitedwest.com. Sorry, unitedwest.org. What else? Those are the main ones anyway. So please feel free
LLC,
to,
what's the name of your LLC?
It's Lopez Liberty LLC, and I have submitted the paperwork some time ago, but with everything slowed down, I don't have it completed or back in my hands yet, but it's coming. And at some point, I will have to work on a website, which I dread.
Thank you. Well, we're fortunate, so fortunate to have Claire with us. We've got partners like Christine and Robert at Jihad Watch, Leo Homan at leohoman.com, and Dr. Mark Christian is at globalfaith.org. We want you to follow these folks, see what they're up to, support them in any way you can. Of course, Tom Trento is our mentor at unitedwest.org. Sharam has the Till Project. By the way, these people in their own ways, let's say Sharam's got a series of webinars. In addition to being on some of ours, he's got a series of webinars, so go to his website, follow him. Steve Kirby, I think he did a great job, Claire, of making the point about how significant Dr. Steve Kirby's work is. That is his website, islamseries.org. Jim Simpson is running for Congress, and Jim Simpson, actually, we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but Claire, you were on a webinar with Jim Simpson just last week. We're going to talk about that. So, you know, Jim's a partner, and certainly a person like Jim Simpson or Laura Loomer that's running for Congress, we certainly want to invite you to get to know them and understand the depth of their platforms. I know Jim has done a great job on his platforms, his endorsements, et cetera, Claire. I know that you've worked with Jim.
Yes, I did.
Patrick Wood, technocracy.news, Raymond Ibrahim, et cetera. I wanted to mention Robert Muse as a partner. Robert Muse at AmericanFreedomLawCenter.org in the last 2 weeks has had some really important legal successes. The American Freedom Law Center, as you know, we have got another great center up there too called Thomas More, but they have been active in the state of Michigan, trying to reestablish the freedoms that the governor of Michigan has been aggressively taking away. And Robert Muse and the company have been successful on 2 occasions, helping people in Michigan regain in front of the courts some of the rights they have to assembly, et cetera, and free speech that the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, potentially a vice presidential candidate, has been taking away from them. So I just wanted to mention that we're just really blessed, and we really do appreciate that. Claire, you were on a webinar last week with Jim, and it had really interesting, right? You had constitutional sheriff from Frederick, Maryland. Yes. You had the head of the Constitutional Sheriff's Organization, your presentation. Jim put it all together. But there was another gentleman that spoke, and I just want to touch base on that if I can. And that's this whole topic of, well, first of all, the topic that where the clock is ticking, the bottom of the point is the fact that we are available for feedback on anything we're doing, but particularly on this subject at Spearpoint 911 at ShariaCrimeStoppers.org. So Spearpoint 911, ShariaCrimeStoppers.org. What we'd like to invite you to do is send us some notes. Mary and I see the notes, particularly on this topic. I think we touched on it. The economy is so important to Donald Trump and his success. We've talked about what happens if Joe wins. Can Trump win if the restart fails? Well, the restart has got all these moving parts. It's got 3 phases in 50 states. So there's at least 150 gears turning on, falling back on the whole economic restart. Ideally, if Mr. Kudlow is correct, the third quarter will be up. But there's a whole lot of people who will try very hard for the restart to have problems. So here's a thought. We have a situation, and the party that talked after Clare last week was Benjamin Newsma, who runs an organization or company called Navigo. And this is where there's information about how much economic and non-COVID health, or how much economic and health damage is being done to low-risk counties. Well, that's an interesting question. If you're a person on our webinar who's working to try to start the economy in Maryland or the economy in Michigan or Texas, what information do you actually have other than your patriotic support and your rallies? All good stuff, but do you have access to data? Well, there is an organization, and we're looking at it. We're just going to invite you to go there and look at it. It's called Restart Now. It's a tool, and it provides information. It has models of different states. The website is there, restartnow.io/models. And I just wanted to bring this to your attention and spend just a couple more minutes to show you a little bit about what it is. It's a bunch of models that are county specific for various states, and it can help you as a restart agent in your state or your county with real information. I just want to give you a taste of it. I will confess that I do not understand the model completely. So this is going to be an amateur's view, but I just want you to look at it and maybe take a homework assignment. There you go, to just take a look at this thing. So it's a website. You go to restartnow.io/models. You look at the United States. Well, guess what? This company has built a model for the states in, I guess that's an orange color, and you can select a state. Again, we're just going to try to give you a taste in a minute and a half here. If we just pick any state, let's say Michigan, it turns out there is a model for Michigan. Well, gee whiz, if you're working in Michigan and there's a whole bunch of people driving cars and caravans, but if you really have to talk to somebody, do you realize that as of right now, if you shut down right now, the governor there is responsible for $107 billion of lost economy. 1.2 million jobs have been lost in the state of Michigan. This model even takes into account other non-COVID health problems. They look at the average suicide in a given state or a given county, and they look at the incremental suicide in this period. Hard to believe, 664 people have taken their lives in addition to the average during this shutdown, during this quarantine. So this is, it's an intuitive thing. I'm not going to try to explain it. I just want to show you a couple things. You can verify how many counties are low risk to COVID, and how much money have those, in this case, $13 billion has been lost in the counties in Michigan that have a low risk of COVID. And this is obviously built on models. We know the problems with models. All the models are described, all the sources are described here. You can figure out how valid they are. On a county by county basis, you can see all kinds of information, COVID deaths by county, cases. There's no recovery data because the recovery data has not been reported. You can look at job losses by county, and you can look at economic impact. I want to give you just a taste for the detail. If somebody says, well, how do they look at COVID risk? Well, I'm interested. There's population, actual cases. How dense is the population? How rural or urban is it? What kind of work is done there? Oh, by the way, does the work have a high interactive situation? Are these plants where people have to be near each other and so on? Are there a lot of preconditions? Do people smoke? Are there a lot of aged people in that county? So county by county, all the way up to the suicide rate and all the way up to within to look at various industries in the state related to their relative percentage of gain or loss in terms of economic activity. Obviously, it's just there. So the point is, if you have an interest, you may want to check it out. It's that simple. If you do check it out and find it interesting, send us a note at Spearpoint 911 ShariaCrimeStoppers.org. Based on the kind of feedback we get, we may dive into it and try to get some more information. I want you to understand, we are a resource. So you're on the one team. If you have an interest to pull together people in your state to study this topic, we'll make our platform, our Zoom platform, available to you. Just contact us. If you want to study the model, you want to set up a workshop on the model, we'll try to work out something with the company and put a webinar together specifically for you and your county. That's what we think we can contribute to the program. So Claire, what would you like to say to the audience in terms of a closing comment that would kind of wrap up what you've talked about?
Well, I would just say that as counties and states begin to open up, it does, help give a little bit of a sense of encouragement. I happen to be a runner, and so I get out in my neighborhood, and no, I don't wear a mask. And
There you go.
as I was going around this past weekend, I noticed kids out. I'm in a residential suburban neighborhood in the DC metro area. Kids all over the streets, they're riding their bikes. I can hear parties going on, barbecues in people's yards, music coming out of the yard. So take encouragement that hopefully the worst is behind us. Things will begin to look up now. And we need to do everything we can to encourage a very solid reopening, that it goes well, that it goes smoothly, and that we give it everything we can to help it be successful. And then finally, I guess, just realize that there is still a world out there that is not COVID-19, and there's lots going on. We will do our best to continue to bring you news about that from time to time. So thank you very much for being with us tonight, for staying with us for a very long session tonight. Much appreciated. And thank you very much.
Well, great. Thank you, audience, for being with us. And thank you, Claire, as well. And thank you, Mary, for pushing all the buttons. And with that, we'll ask Mary to go ahead and end the meeting. Good night, everybody.